April 1945. The war in Europe is collapsing, but the cold lingers in the northern air like a final warning. A thin layer of frost clings to the edges of a forest track near the outskirts of a small German village. In the half-light of early morning, a group of exhausted German women stand together, nurses, clerks, and auxiliaries pressed into service by a regime that no longer exists in any real shape. Their uniforms are worn, their faces hollow from weeks of retreat, and the distant rumble of artillery has faded into an eerie silence. Then they hear it. Slow, deliberate steps crunching through the frost. A British patrol emerges through the trees, helmets low, rifles slung, eyes cautious. Their cocky silhouettes move with a calm discipline the women had never expected from the enemy they had been taught to fear. The women freeze, not in defiance, but in shock. Because the soldiers standing before them look nothing like the propaganda images they had been shown. For a long breath, no one speaks. Only the mist of cold air rises between the two groups. And this quiet moment, almost fragile, marks the beginning of a story shaped by the final, unraveling weeks of the war. Which brings us to the wider context behind this encounter. By early April 1945, Germany was a nation collapsing under the weight of a war it could no longer sustain. The Western Allies, having pushed through the Rhine at Remagen and crossed in massive force during Operation Plunder, were moving rapidly across the heart of the Reich. British, Canadian, and American divisions advanced through shattered towns, bypassing pockets of resistance that lacked ammunition, leadership, and purpose. The once formidable Wehrmacht was disintegrating. Units surrendered by the thousands, often without firing a shot. Desertion soared. Command structures broke apart as communication lines failed, and entire battalions fled eastward, hoping to escape the oncoming Soviet armies. Amid this chaos, civilian displacement reached its peak. German men were either dead, captured, or still fighting in scattered formations. Roads filled with refugees, wounded soldiers, and support personnel trying to escape the front. Among them were female auxiliaries, members of the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and various administrative branches who had served in communications, nursing, clerical work, and logistics. As the war dragged into its final months, many were forced to move with retreating military units, often without clear orders or protection. By spring, these women had endured weeks of hunger, cold, and disinformation. German propaganda warned that Allied soldiers, particularly the British and Americans, were brutal and merciless. Leaflets and broadcasts emphasized fear and humiliation, insisting that surrender would bring violence or exploitation. For many young women raised under Nazi rule, such images formed their entire understanding of the enemy. And so, when the front finally caught up with them, the result was not only fear, but genuine disbelief at what they encountered. The Allied advance, particularly in northern and western Germany, brought British infantry battalions into dozens of small villages where retreating German support staff, often including groups of women, found themselves stranded. With roads blocked, fuel gone, and command units dissolved, these women had no direction except to wait, hope, or hide. The scene near the small forested track in early April was one of many such moments created by the rapid British sweep across Lower Saxony and Schleswig-Holstein. And to understand why British patrols were moving methodically through these rural areas, we must examine the doctrine and occupation planning that shaped their actions. This leads us to the deeper institutional framework behind the encounter. The British Army entered northern Germany in 1945 with strict orders governing the treatment of civilians and prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention of 1929, which the United Kingdom adhered to closely, outlined clear rules for handling captured personnel, including women serving in military roles. British units were repeatedly briefed to maintain discipline, avoid looting, and treat all prisoners, combatants, or auxiliaries with fairness. For troops who had spent years in combat, these rules were more than instructions. They were a point of pride, distinguishing their conduct from the abuses reported on other fronts. Processing posts followed a consistent system. First contact was cautious, weapons ready, but postures restrained. Once disarmed and identified, prisoners were escorted to temporary holding points, softened bars. schoolhouses, or requisition buildings where medical checks, documentation, and interrogation could take place. Women captured in this period were not treated differently in legal status, but units often assigned senior non-commissioned officers or military police to ensure procedures were followed precisely. Aware of the political sensitivity surrounding the capture of female auxiliaries, on the German side, information gaps were enormous. For years, Nazi propaganda had portrayed British soldiers as colonial brutes and disciplined, violent, and vengeful. Films such as Siegem Weston and countless radio broadcasts painted caricatures rather than real adversaries. To young German women raised in the Hitler Youth system, the idea of British troops behaving calmly or professionally was almost unimaginable. This cultural chasm set the stage for the shock so many experienced at surrender. Short human glimpses from both sides illustrate the gulf. British infantrymen tired from constant advances often remarked in diaries about their surprise at encountering German women in uniform. Many had expected hardened zealots, yet found clerks, nurses, and radio assistants barely out of their teens. German women, in turn, were often trembling, waiting for violence that never came. Some were so convinced of Allied cruelty that they burst into tears when British soldiers simply offered water or blankets to maintain order during the rapid advance. British patrols were dispatched ahead of main units to locate stragglers, disarm troops, and supply dumps. These patrols moved in small groups, scanning woods, farm roads, and abandoned outposts. Their mission was simple: secure the area before larger formations passed through. And it is during one such patrol moving quietly through the cold edges of a village in early April that the specific encounter at the heart of this documentary unfolds. Fear, bewilderment, morale collapse for the German women caught in the final weeks of April 1945. The emotional landscape was dominated by exhaustion and fear. Many had marched for days without clear instructions, following retreating units that vanished overnight. Hunger hollowed their faces. Sleeplessness made their movements slow and unsteady. They had spent years hearing warnings about Allied brutality, so every distant engine or footstep tightened their stomachs. What struck them hardest in those final days was not defiance, but the collapse of everything they believed. The Reich that had promised them security had simply disappeared. When British soldiers finally appeared, the women stood motionless, not only terrified, but bewildered that the men before them looked disciplined, calm, and nothing like the monsters they had been taught to expect. British patrol procedures and orders. British patrols entering rural German zones were trained to operate with methodical precision. Their doctrine emphasized caution without escalation. A small, forward unit would advance ahead of the main battalion, scanning for snipers, abandoned outposts, or retreating soldiers. In POW situations, the process was standard: approach slowly, maintain spacing, secure weapons first, and identify ranks. The men were instructed to avoid unnecessary aggression. The goal was control, not confrontation. They understood that the war was nearly over, and casualties at this stage served no purpose. When encountering women in uniform, they followed the same rules of engagement: firm, alert, but not hostile. Their behavior reflected not only discipline, but the expectation that any surrender must be handled cleanly to preserve order on the route of advance, conditions that shaped the encounter. Though late spring approached, the early April air still carried winter's sharpness. Frost hardened the ground, forcing patrols to move quietly but carefully along narrow tracks. Many German vehicles lay abandoned with empty fuel tanks, leaving women auxiliaries stranded far from command posts. British units, by contrast, operated with relatively stable logistics, functioning radios, organized supply trucks, and standardized uniforms that offered warmth and protection. Their communication systems allowed quick updates on enemy stragglers, enabling patrols to pinpoint areas where groups might be hiding. These logistical advantages created the uneven dynamic of the encounter: one side cold, hungry, and directionless, the other equipped and informed. And from this imbalance emerged a deeper layer of leadership decisions and enemy perceptions, British command decisions, and constraints. British officers overseeing the final push into northern Germany carried dual responsibilities, maintain momentum towards strategic objectives, and stabilize every area they captured. Orders from corps and division levels stressed the importance of treating prisoners strictly according to the Geneva Convention to avoid diplomatic repercussions after the war. Commanders also understood that surrendering women, in particular, required firm supervision to prevent misunderstandings or panic. Officers often delegated experienced NCOs to manage these interactions, knowing their steady presence reduced the chance of disorder. The overarching directive was simple: secure the region quickly, maintain discipline, and ensure no incident, no matter how small, damaged Britain's reputation as an occupying force. German leadership, denial, and propaganda. German leadership during the war's final weeks oscillated between denial and desperation. Radio broadcasts insisted that British forces would impose humiliation and violence upon German women, reinforcing the idea that surrender was dangerous. Civil administrators fled towns ahead of Allied advances, leaving support staff abandoned without guidance. For many German women, these propagandized images shaped their expectations far more than personal experience. When reality contradicted the warnings, when British soldiers behaved predictably and professionally, it produced an emotional shock. The women realized that their leadership had deceived them, and this revelation struck with almost the same force as the military defeat itself. It was not just the collapse of the front, it was the collapse of trust. German leadership, denial, and propaganda. German leadership during the war's final weeks oscillated between denial and desperation. Radio broadcasts insisted that British forces would impose humiliation and violence upon German women, reinforcing the idea that surrender was dangerous. Civil administrators fled towns ahead of Allied advances, leaving support staff abandoned without guidance. For many German women, these propagandized images shaped their expectations far more than personal experience. When reality contradicted the warnings, when British soldiers behaved predictably and professionally, it produced an emotional shock. The women realized that their leadership had deceived them, and this revelation struck with almost the same force as the military defeat itself. It was not just the collapse of the front, it was the collapse of trust. The British patrol moved with slow, deliberate steps as they approached the clearing. Their sergeant, a veteran of North Africa and Normandy, raised a hand for silence. The frost under their boots crackled softly, the only sound in a morning air that felt suspended between war and surrender. Ahead, the shapes of the German women came into clearer view. None held weapons. Their hands were visible, fingers pale from the cold, yet the sergeant kept his men spread out, maintaining the triangular spacing drilled into them through years of combat. He addressed them firmly but without aggression. Hands up, slow, no sudden movements. The women obeyed immediately. Some lifted their arms with mechanical stiffness, while others trembled so visibly that the British soldiers instinctively softened their posture. One woman, a radio assistant barely 20, looked as though she might collapse, her legs shaking under the weight of fear and exhaustion. The sergeant motioned to men forward. They checked for sidearms, finding only a few personal items: a notebook, a ration tin, a cracked wristwatch. The women were relieved of their belts, not roughly, but with the matter-of-fact efficiency of soldiers who had performed this process many times before. What none of them expected was the next order. Water bottle, pass it forward. One British private unscrewed his canteen and offered it to the nearest woman. She hesitated, unable to reconcile the gesture with everything she had been taught. When she finally took it, her expression shifted, fear giving way to disbelief. Another soldier handed out a wool scarf from his pack when he noticed a woman's hands turning numb. These small acts, routine for the British, were enormous for the women who had braced themselves for brutality. Their breathing eased, their shoulders lowered. Something fragile, almost human, flickered between the two groups. The sergeant then issued the formal command: escort them to the road. Holding points half a mile west, a line formed, British soldiers walking alongside the German women, maintaining vigilance but not hostility. The women, now processing the unexpected reality before them, exchanged glances as if silently. admitting that the world they knew had ended long before this moment. But as the patrol escorted the group toward the road, a sudden radio message cracked through on the British wireless, another group of German personnel unknown number. Possible armed stragglers had been spotted nearby. The encounter, once quiet and almost humane, was about to ripple outward into something much larger. The radio message changed the atmosphere instantly. British soldiers tightened their grip on their rifles, eye-scanning the tree line. The sergeant ordered the patrol to halt and reposition. The German women, sensing the shift, froze again, unsure whether the danger came from the British or from their own fleeing countrymen. The sergeant spoke calmly but decisively. "You will stay here. No sudden movements." His tone was firm, but nothing in it suggested panic. He dispatched 2 men toward the reported sighting, sending another back along the road to alert the main column. The possibility of armed German holdouts made the situation volatile. A single shot could unravel the fragile control he had established. The women, huddled together, watched the British operate with structured coordination they had never witnessed in the collapsing Wehrmacht. Every movement was purposeful, every command was clear. There was no shouting, no chaos, only discipline. Within minutes, the forward scouts returned. "Sir, it's a group of 4 mixed personnel. No weapons visible, but they're cautious. Looks like they're debating surrender." The sergeant understood the stakes. If those stragglers panicked, they could flee into the woods or approach in the wrong manner, triggering a confrontation. And with vulnerable prisoners already in their care, any misstep could lead to tragedy. He issued new instructions: secure this group first, move them to the holding point. Once they're safe, we proceed. The women were guided toward the road again, but now the escort was doubled. What had started as a simple processing operation had evolved into a layered tactical situation. The British soldiers' calm interactions with the women contrasted sharply with the tension simmering in the woods, where uncertain German remnants still wandered without guidance. As they reached the holding point, a small farmhouse previously checked for weapons, the women were formally registered. Names, ranks, units, medical conditions. Some were given blankets. Others were examined for frostbite or exhaustion. The British medics approached their tasks with the same neutrality used in Italy, Normandy, and the Low Countries. For the women, this treatment was almost surreal. Several broke down not from mistreatment, but from the emotional release of realizing that the enemy was not what they had been told. The shock of humane conduct struck them harder than confrontation ever could. By midday, British forces detained the second group of German stragglers without incident. The area was declared secure. Reports were filed, documenting the number of prisoners, condition, and sequence of events. For the sergeant and his men, it was one more entry in a long campaign. But for the German women, the encounter was a moment that shattered years of propaganda and fear. A moment that would be recorded in units' war diaries, prisoner processing logs, and later testimonies. In the hours following the encounter, British operational routines took over with quiet efficiency. The German women, numbering just under a dozen, were transferred from the temporary holding point to a larger processing station established in a nearby village schoolhouse. The site had been converted into a field reception center used by British units throughout northern Germany in April 1945. Here, military police took detailed records, names, unit affiliations, dates of service entries that would later appear in battalion diaries and corps-level POW summaries. Medical teams examined each woman, noting signs of malnutrition, exhaustion, and early frostbite. These assessments were not unique. British reports from the period frequently mentioned the deteriorated condition of German auxiliary personnel encountered during the final advance. The women received basic rations, hardtack, tea, and in some cases, emergency chocolate bars issued to ease shock. It was the first proper food many had eaten in days. Meanwhile, the British patrol filed its own immediate report. The sergeant's notes included the approximate time of contact, the location along the forest track, the absence of weapons among the prisoners, and the sighting of the second stray group later secured without resistance. These entries aligned with a broader pattern across northern Germany, where disorganized German detachments routinely emerged along secondary roads. Attempting to surrender piecemeal as front lines dissolved, the local security situation shifted as well. With the area cleared of potential stragglers, civilian movement became more visible. Farmers emerged cautiously from basements. Women carrying children approached the British holding point seeking news, safety, or simply reassurance that the fighting had passed. In many such locations, British soldiers established small cordons and patrol cycles to stabilize routes for the main columns advancing deeper into the region. The German women taken into custody were soon relocated again, this time to a more permanent POW camp farther west. Transportation was orderly escorted lorries following marked routes to logistical hubs where thousands of other surrendering personnel were being processed. Their arrival was documented like all others, placed in barrack sections designated for non-combat support staff, separated by unit type, and monitored by British administrative officers who rotated through the camps as the number of prisoners expanded. All of these immediate steps recording, transport, securing the village, stabilizing refugee movement formed only the opening layer of consequences. To understand how the encounter resonated beyond the day it occurred, one must look at the institutional files, long-term testimonies, and psychological impressions it left behind. In the weeks following the surrender, the encounter became part of a broader administrative record that British forces compiled across newly occupied German territories. Unit war diaries from infantry divisions operating in Lower Saxony noted the increasing number of women auxiliary surrendering in small groups, often dehydrated or disoriented. These diaries, compiled daily, form some of the clearest institutional evidence of how widespread such scenes were. The specific report from the sergeant's patrol, like many others, was entered into battalion logs, summarizing unarmed female personnel taken into custody during clearing operations. In post-war archival collections, including British Army prisoner registration files, several of the women from this incident later appeared in standardized processing charts. Their occupations were listed as Nachrichtenhilfe and Signals Assistant, Krankenschwester Nurse, or Schreibkraft Clerk. Notations indicated no resistance offered and no disciplinary concerns, a pattern consistent with the final phase of German collapse. Psychologically, the encounter left a significant mark on the women who experienced it. Years later, in scattered interviews and local German histories compiled in the late 20th century, survivors described the moment as a profound emotional rupture. The shock of being treated according to Geneva rules rather than the brutality they had been taught to expect forced a reevaluation of the propaganda they had internalized. Several accounts noted that their first experience with enemy soldiers fundamentally reshaped their understanding of the outside world, even before post-war political realities took shape. For the British Army, such encounters contributed to a growing awareness of the scale of civilian and auxiliary dislocation across the German interior. Reports filed after the campaign referenced the logistical challenges of processing unexpectedly high numbers of female personnel, leading to minor procedural adjustments in holding facilities, transport allocations, and medical screening. None of these changes were dramatic, but they reflected an evolving understanding of the human landscape of occupied Germany. Local governance also began its slow reconstruction. With villages secured and major roads under Allied control, British military government units initiated administrative assessments identifying essential workers, stabilizing food supplies, and determining which civilians could resume agricultural duties. Encounters like this one informed their understanding of how deeply propaganda had shaped German civilian expectations and how critical disciplined conduct was in preventing panic. These long-term consequences, administrative, psychological, and logistical, circle back to the central theme of the event, the collapse of a worldview built on fear. And from that collapse emerged broader historical lessons that extend beyond a single encounter. In the quiet after violence, History often leaves behind fragments, footprints in frozen earth, a torn sleeve, a half-spoken plea. The encounter between the British patrol and the German women in the winter of 1945 is one of those moments that seems small on the map of a collapsing Reich, yet vast in what it reveals about the human condition. It was a meeting shaped not by strategy or ideology, but by exhaustion, fear, and the sudden collision of two worlds that had been taught to see each other only as enemies. For the German women, the war had stripped away certainty, identity, and even the basic expectation of safety. Their response, hesitation, mistrust, quiet surrender, echoed the psychological ruin of a nation unraveling. For the British soldiers, hardened by years of combat yet bound by training and law, the moment demanded restraint, empathy, and adherence to values even when standing before those who belong to the aggressor state. In that brief, frozen encounter, both sides confronted the uncomfortable truth that war does not erase humanity. It only distorts it. This incident also illuminates how profoundly gender shaped wartime experience. These women nurses, auxiliaries, clerks, or simply civilians swept into uniform found themselves caught between collapsing lines and advancing armies. Their fates determined not by their actions, but by the machinery of a war they could no longer influence. As the film closes, we return to that opening image, women standing in the snow, a patrol emerging through the winter haze. A moment suspended in history, fragile, human, and unforgettable.